Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. With this episode, we're moving once again from east to west, and to one of the great figures in the history of the Western Church, Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose is one of the four great fathers of the West. This was the original roster of the doctors of the Church. His peers in that very elite group were Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. Ambrose was many things. He was a theologian and interpreter of Scripture. He was a preacher and a writer. He was a pioneering composer of Latin hymns. But most importantly, perhaps, he established the model for Western bishops in their relations with secular powers. Aurelius Ambrosius was born to lead. He came from the old Roman aristocracy, and his family was devoted to civil service. His father was a high-ranking official in the northwestern provinces, and Ambrose grew up in an area that today is in Germany, near the border with Belgium and Luxembourg. The family was Christian, and both of his siblings would eventually enter religious life. Right around the midpoint of the 4th century, Ambrose's father died while his children were in their teens, and the family moved to Rome to complete their education. Rome was still the symbolic capital of the West. The Senate met there, and all the great buildings and monuments were there. But the administrative capital of the empire had long since moved north to Milan, a city more easily defended. In Rome, young Ambrose excelled in law and rhetoric, the subjects required for a career in civil service. By age 30, he had already attained important leadership positions in the city. And when he was only 32, he was appointed governor of Liguria and Emilia, the region that included the city of Milan. Though he was very young, Ambrose had already surpassed the accomplishments of his very successful father. Now he was regularly in the presence of the emperor and visible to the VIPs at the imperial court. No one doubted that he was destined for greatness in government. He was respected and loved, moreover, by the people he governed. He had a reputation for intelligence and fairness. The people of Milan at that time were deeply divided in religious matters. The majority were Christians who accepted the faith as it had been taught by the Council of Nicaea almost a half-century before. But a large minority rejected the teaching of Nicaea and professed Arianism, and that Arian minority was quite influential. It included the Empress Justina and the current bishop of Milan, Auxentius. Everyone knew that Ambrose's sympathies lay with the Nicene party. That was no secret. Yet he treated members of both parties with respect, and he even extended the same respect to those few aristocrats who still kept to the worship of the old Roman gods. He was honored in return. When the bishop Auxentius died, however, anxiety rose throughout the land. Who would be his successor? Who would serve as bishop in the capital city? The Arians, of course, wanted an Arian, someone who would favor them as Auxentius had through his 19 years as bishop. But the Nicenes believed they had suffered long enough. The Pope in Rome had formally declared Auxentius a heretic, and yet the man remained in office through the graces of the Empress Justina. Whoever assumed the office of bishop in Milan would exercise tremendous influence, not only locally, but throughout the world, because the bishop of Milan was someone who had the attention of everyone at the imperial court. The bishop of Milan could not help but influence the influencers. Whether you were Arian or Nicene by persuasion, if you lived in Milan, you knew that a lot was riding on the choice of the next bishop. Now, in those days, the bishops were customarily chosen by the clergy of the city. The clergy would then submit the name of their choice to the Pope for approval. But ordinary Christians also had their ways of participating in the process. In this particular case, members of both parties took to the streets in mobs and made their voices heard. They first surrounded and then entered the church where the electors had gathered. Once inside, the mobs shouted their party's slogans, and then slogans gave way to threats. Tempers rose, and soon it seemed that violence was inevitable. Word reached Ambrose, and the young governor rushed to the scene. He stood in the midst of the mobs and somehow managed to quiet them down. Then he summoned all of his excellence in rhetoric as he tried to de-escalate the situation. He made a long speech, we are told, explaining the horrible consequences that would follow upon a riot. The military would arrive and subdue the mobs with the force of arms, and the bloodshed would be horrific. He urged them to make peace, to find consensus, and preserve their lives and whatever remained of concord in the Christian church. The crowd was awestruck by his eloquence. Members of both parties murmured their assent to his sound reason. Then suddenly a voice arose. Ambrose for bishop. And more voices joined in. And then more. And then more. Ambrose for bishop. Ambrose for bishop, they chanted. And the clergy electors concurred. So they sent a messenger to seek approval of the Emperor Valentinian, because if Ambrose was going to be their bishop, he could no longer serve as their governor. The emperor saw God's hand in the strange events that took place that day, and he gave his consent. But there was still a problem. Ambrose had not yet been baptized. Like many believers in that time, he had deferred the sacraments of initiation till well into adulthood. He knew that governance could be a bloody and dirty business, and he did not want to risk committing mortal sin after baptism. So he was not yet a member of the church. Though he came from a Christian family, he was not yet an initiated Christian. And now he was about to become bishop. He did what seemed most sensible, and tried by various means to refuse the appointment. He even went into hiding, but no one from the emperor on down showed any signs of budging. So he received a crash course from an old priest named Simplicianus, and he received the sacraments in a remarkably rapid succession. Baptism, confirmation, first communion, ordination. Thus the young governor became a young bishop. Later legends certainly exaggerate Ambrose's unreadiness for the office. Yes, he was unbaptized, but he was nonetheless a well-educated intellectual who had grown up in a Christian family and been instructed by Christian tutors. It's likely that he knew his Bible pretty well and was well-versed in the theological controversies of his day. We've seen how doctrinal disputes often disrupted the social order. A good governor could not afford to be ignorant of the subtleties of the theological arguments. In any event, from the beginning of his episcopate, Ambrose showed remarkable mastery of biblical interpretation and theological exposition. He read the masterworks in both Greek and Latin. He stayed abreast of recent developments in theology all over the world. He corresponded with eminent contemporaries such as Basil the Great. He assimilated the ideas of a variety of thinkers and freely incorporated them into his own writing. Jerome accused Ambrose of plagiarism because he borrowed so freely from the sources he read in Greek. He would sometimes translate without any clear attribution. In Greek, he ranged in Philo, Plotinus, Origen, Athanasius, Cyril, and Didymus the Blind. In Latin, he seemed to be familiar with the entire literary tradition, though he was most clearly influenced by Cicero. Through more than 2 decades as bishop, Ambrose was prolific in his literary output. He won renown for his daily preaching and teaching. Among his works are profound doctrinal expositions produced at the personal request of the emperor. He also composed a series of studies of the Old Testament patriarchs, which modern scholars recognize as the first attempt to articulate a theology of the laity. Ambrose was profoundly influential in the field of liturgy as well. In his lectures on the Church's rituals, he left us our oldest witness to the prayers of the Latin Mass. In fact, he is also the earliest witness to use the word Mass, which was then a colloquial term, apparently, for the rite. He was a liturgical pioneer who adapted Eastern musical forms for use in the West. He composed hymns that are still sung today, both in their original Latin and in English translation. And yet Ambrose is best known for none of these remarkable achievements. He has achieved almost mythic status in the West primarily for his firm governance of the church, especially in key moments when the state threatened the church's authority and liberty. Remember that Ambrose presided over the church in the empire's western capital, and his years coincided with not only religious disputes, but also civil unrest. When Ambrose was ordained, the West was ruled by Valentinian I, but Valentinian died the year after Ambrose was ordained, and the negotiated succession was strange to say the least. Power in the West would thereafter be shared by Valentinian's two sons, Gratian, who was then 16 years old, and Valentinian II, who was then 4 years old. The elder Valentinian had been married twice, and the boys were half-brothers, one from each marriage. Gratian was known to favor Nicene Christianity. The younger Valentinian was too young to have an opinion, but he was ruling under the guardianship of his mother, Justina, who was ardently Arian. Justina, in fact, was the only adult in the room, and the real power in the capital city, and she was no great friend to Ambrose. For however Ambrose had accommodated the Arians when he was in civil office, he could not do the same as bishop of the Catholic Church. His duty was to the truth, and he believed Arian doctrine to be incompatible with God's revelation. It arrived as something of a shock when Ambrose's sympathies were borne out in the particulars of public worship. The Arians believed that the Son of God was a creature and not fully divine. This was reflected in their liturgical prayers and in their devotional art. While those forms had prevailed under Auxentius, the previous bishop, they stopped when Ambrose took over. So the Arians were not pleased with the situation. More to the point, the Empress Justina was not pleased. In the year 385, she forced a crisis by demanding that Ambrose turn over 2 churches for Arian use. But Ambrose refused. The churches, he said, weren't his to give. They belonged to God, and God was with the Catholic Church. He said that a temple of God could not be surrendered by a bishop. Ambrose refused to give Justina and her Arian friends even 1 church, never mind 2. And then things started to get ugly. The Orthodox mob, hearing that the emperor was going to take the basilica by force, seized one of the Arian priests and probably would have killed him if Ambrose hadn't sent out his own priests and deacons to rescue the poor man. Then the emperor sent messengers directly to Ambrose demanding that he turn over the basilica. Ambrose insisted that God's property was not subject to the imperial power, no matter how powerful the emperor might be. He told the messengers, "Does he want my inheritance? Take it. Does he want to take me away? I'll go at once. Do you want to put me in chains or sentence me to death? It will be a joy to me. I won't defend myself behind the mob. I won't cling to the altars and beg for my life, but I will happily die for the altars." When the mob heard that the emperor was going to send soldiers to take the church by force, they made a spontaneous decision to stage a sit-in. They locked themselves in the building and barricaded the doors. They refused to come out, daring the soldiers to come in and get them. So what do you do with a crowd like that? Once the first excitement has worn off, people begin to realize that they've gotten themselves into a jam. There's a lot of tense waiting while nothing happens, but people's imaginations run wild with what could happen. Something had to be done to keep up the spirits of the peaceful protesters before they either panicked and gave up, or worse, turned to violence again. Ambrose got them singing. Now you could picture the standoff from the soldiers' point of view. Here they are, armed with swords and spears, milling about outside a church. From inside, they hear Christian hymns. And the leader of the singing is Ambrose himself, the most respected man in Milan. The soldiers could not bring themselves to violate the sanctuary of the church or do violence to the protesters. It was a standoff, a staring contest, and Ambrose won. In the course of the crisis, he coined a phrase that would express the Western Church's approach to imperial and royal power ever afterward. He said, "The emperor is within the church, not above the church." Ambrose further elucidated the principle when the boy emperor Valentinian tried to summon a council of the church. Ambrose wrote to Valentinian, "When have you heard, most gracious emperor, that laymen give judgment concerning a bishop in a matter of faith? Are we so prostrate through the flattery of some as to be unmindful of the rights of the priesthood? And do I think that I can entrust to others what God has given me?" Again, Ambrose was clear about the distinction between throne and altar. He insisted that he would willingly obey Caesar in matters in which Caesar legitimately had authority. But, he continued, if a bishop is to be taught by a layman, what will follow? Let the layman argue, and the bishop listen. Let the bishop learn from the layman. But undoubtedly, whether we go through the series of the Holy Scriptures or the times of old, who is there who can deny that in a matter of faith, in a matter, I say, of faith, bishops are accustomed to judge of Christian emperors, not emperors of bishops? Ambrose made those judgments without fear or favor. His most famous exercise of church authority came some years later, when he rendered the most severe judgment against the great Theodosius, the Eastern emperor who favored the Nicene cause. Theodosius was unquestionably orthodox, but he was not without his faults. When his governor in Thessalonica was assassinated in 390 AD, Theodosius threw a tantrum that ended in the indiscriminate massacre of 7,000 residents of that city. Ambrose responded by refusing communion to the emperor. Legend has Ambrose blocking Theodosius's path as the emperor tried to enter the church. But what we know to be true is that Ambrose wrote Theodosius a private letter in which he persuaded the emperor that after such a glaring public crime, he needed to make an equally public penance before he could receive absolution. With another emperor, that letter might have cost Ambrose his life. Theodosius, however, submitted to the judgment of the bishop. In the end, Theodosius had to go through a long and very public penance before Ambrose would lift his excommunication. The emperor laid aside all the insignia of power and lamented his sin in the church, where everyone could see. It made a powerful impression on the people. The emperor himself was setting the example of penance. Nor was it just a political stunt. Ambrose seems to have reached the emperor's conscience and made a real impression on him. By all accounts, including the account of Ambrose who delivered Theodosius's funeral oration years later, the emperor's contrition was sincere. For the rest of his life, Ambrose remembered, not a day went by when he did not grieve for his error. For his part, Theodosius seems to have understood that Ambrose had shown him real Christian love, the love that sometimes prescribes bitter medicine to cure a deadly case of sin. Theodosius said, "I don't know of any bishop worthy of the name except Ambrose." Repeatedly, Ambrose showed himself willing to suffer what he called the priest's usual fate. By standing against the ultimate earthly power, he showed his people that there is no power they need fear. All powers in heaven and earth and under the earth are subject to God, and so all human fears should be subordinated to fear of the Lord. His example has been invoked in every generation as bishops face the incursions of would-be tyrants. Ambrose articulated the principles, and he modeled the courage that would play out again in the lives of heroic figures from Thomas à Becket to Cardinal Monsanti. Willing to become a martyr, Ambrose died in his bed in 397, with his arms outstretched in prayer. If he did not suffer the priest's usual fate, he passed from this life making the priest's characteristic gesture, the orans figure of Christ on the cross, the orans posture of a priest at the altar. I thank you for listening today. Ambrose is one of my favorite figures in all of history, and I love to talk about him in good company. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider making a contribution for the continuation of our series. Pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. We pray for our benefactors every day.
내 걸음 설렘니다 데 가우뎀 단젤리 et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. It's a film club devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture Podcast.